I have one fan. Thank you. Okay, so let me talk to you about a time where I had a moment of realization. It was not too long ago actually, and I was sitting on my table and staring at pages of medical notes. While staring at those pages, by staring I mean trying to learn. So I learned and learned and read, not once, not twice, but 4, 5 times, and nothing would go into my brain. It didn't feel like I was learning, but it felt like I was taking part in an experiment labeled, how much can a person read without actually learning? It was a moment where I surprised myself. I asked myself, why is this happening to me? Excuse me. And in this moment of frustration-fueled wisdom, I went to bed. I closed everything, closed my books, and I went to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, something miraculous happened. I could recall more from the chapter that I studied than I could this morning than I could the night before. And this made me realize something. Maybe it's not what you learn, maybe it's when you learn, or maybe it's how you learn that makes it really important. So let's talk a little bit about learning and the science of learning. Let me ask you this question before I begin. What do you think is more important when you're studying or when you're learning? The facts and the figures that you learn, or how you feel when you are studying? That's a question for you to answer. Let's talk about how learning works. Your brain works kind of like you guys were working with each other in that coffee break. Talking to each other, mingling with each other, socializing. However, you would judge a person based on what they spoke, and you would decide that if you want to continue the conversation or not. Yes? Something similar happens with your brain. Your brain, or memories in your brain, work like a house party, okay? So there's a house party and very selected guests, very selected people, very selected memories get stored in your brain. And what your brain's actively doing when you're learning something is your brain is saying, okay, should I put this memory in a long-term one? Should I put it in short-term memory? Or should I just sweep it somewhere and maybe you won't remember it the next day? A tired brain is working kind of similarly. A tired brain is that day when you have so many things to do, but you're feeling very tired. So you do the first couple of things, you put the papers in your drawer and you go to bed. And look, if I remember it, I remember it. If I don't remember it, it's okay. That's what a tired brain is doing. It's like a janitor sweeping all the memories, and these memories keep piling up in different places. And you have a hard time finding these memories. Now, the hero of this story, or the villain, is something called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain that is responsible for storing memories, for storing information. This hippocampus is the head librarian of your brain. The hippocampus decides where to store the books, where to store the memories. When you don't have sufficient sleep, your hippocampus goes haywire and starts to get confused. Should I store these memories? Should I not store these memories? Or should I just keep them on the back of the head and remind them to you at the most inappropriate time? Ever happened to you? You read something hundreds of times, and when you sit the exam, you don't know, you can't recall, because your hippocampus has stored it in a place where it's not accessible anymore. Now, this head librarian needs its rest, because if the head librarian does not rest, the head librarian does not work. When the head librarian does not work, there are no books, there are no memories, there are no facts in your brain. So how does sleep or rest factor into all of this? Now, when you're sleeping, you're actively making new memories. The parts of your brain, called neurons, are actively rewiring themselves to accommodate for the new memories, to accommodate for the new facts which you have tried to remember. When you sleep, your hippocampus is actually storing these memories into long-term memories or short-term memories. And so when you have enough or sufficient sleep, your brain, it tends to work better. That's why you tend to work better. Sleep cycle is very important, because if you don't have an active sleeping schedule, if you sleep whenever you want, if you overtire yourself, and we have this image of a bleary-eyed student studying at 3 a.m. without a care in the world, I need to focus on my studies, but that's actually less productive than sleeping, as I previously mentioned in my story. When you sleep, your brain makes memories. Your hippocampus works better. Here's another question. A show of hands for all those who think that their sleep schedule is questionable.
Well, at least all of us are ruining our brains together, so we've got that on point. Now, here's the thing. So when we see evidence from these different kind of workings of the brain, we find that the brain, actually, you're studying, actually works differently.
People learn differently than they actually think they do. There are three key takeaways which you need, or the three key ways in which you have to study. The first one being spaced repetition. Spaced repetition means, spaced repetition in itself is a very broad topic to explore, but the general meaning of spaced repetition would be repeating something after giving adequate amount of spaces. So you learn something one day, you repeat it a couple of days later, you repeat it the next week. That's the first thing you do. The second thing which you need to be doing is sleeping enough. If you sleep enough, your brain works more. You need to study less hard. You need to study less harder than the student who's actually not actively speaking. So sleep schedule plays an important role. And finally, adequate nutrition and hydration, the benefits of which are countless. Now, but the problem is, the question then we ask ourselves is, even though human beings know that this is the way to study, this is the way to work, why don't we actually do it? I think that's because the heroic culture nowadays, it's when you ask someone, how did you sleep yesterday? And they answer, oh, I slept only a couple of hours. I had only 14 cups of coffee yesterday because I had to complete my work. I haven't seen the face of my bed in 2 days. All these things, while they do seem academically heroic, actually are academically catastrophic. Now, here's something that we need to understand, and that's this. Once I was teaching a class, and there was a student who said, sleep is for the weak. And I answered, well, memory deprivation or memory devastation is for the weak. We imagine heroic students as being the ones who relentlessly study day and night, but actually it's those who study smarter. Studies show that if you don't have or you don't get a good night's sleep, your brain capacity reduces by 40%. 40. Let that number sink in. Imagine almost half of your intellectual power just dropping down just because you didn't have a good night's rest. 40%, guys. So then we find something. We find that we, as human beings in our culture, have confused hard work with people who look like they're working hard. If you see a student with dark circles, someone who is sleep deprived, we think that this would be a person who is working harder than a person who seems healthier. Maybe that person just works smarter. I've always been an advocate of work smarter, not harder. Some of my students here know that. But the problem is that we are charmed by the philosophy of looking like we work hard, but not actually working hard. This philosophy, this culture, has mistaken intellectual ability for the ability to look like you are working hard. In the long term, we find that learning or success in its extension is not about working hard, but it's about working smarter. Maybe all along, it wasn't about who can run the fastest, but more about who knows the track the best. Thank you.